Welcome back to another Patreon tutorial, and this time we're going to be diving back into Flowerland. And the reason for that is once I had made this tutorial over here, or more of a walkthrough, I have done several flower projects since that for clients, and something I've realized is that a lot of clients don't want just, a procedural flower. They want a very specific type of flower, whether that be a species of flower or a specific type of look that they're after, and they'll give you a reference. And what I found in Houdini is that it's super fun to rig and animate flowers, but it's not as fun trying to hand model each petal and get it to do what you want when it's a very specific species, as well as trying to find the right maps and textures to get there. So you end up spending 80% of the project modeling the flower and only 20% animating and doing the fun stuff. And so I have found that it's actually a lot better just to find a model online, whether it be Turbo Squid or Sketchfab or something, where somebody's done a nice 3D scan of a flower or they've modeled it really well, and you can then take it and animate it and do the fun parts yourself. So this tutorial is about how do we do the fun part, and once we have a flower asset, how do we get going with it? And so I'm here in Houdini, and I have a geo container, and inside here I have a flower. And so for all intents purposes, this is just kind of like an asset that you've downloaded. Maybe you've brought it in, there's nothing to it, there's no animation. I'm going to turn off these back faces here so I don't have to see the blue the whole time. And I particularly picked this flower because there's quite a few issues with it. You'll see if you kind of zoom in here, like there's a gap at the bottom here between the petals. And if you go underneath here, you'll see without this sepal here, like that, you can see right through here, you can just see that this is not super realistic. They all kind of far apart. And so I picked this one on purpose because it looks kind of cool, but as well as there's some problems, and it's a good flower to showcase why this method is better than the previous one I showed where we just bend things. Now, you certainly can just use the bend method like I showed in this tutorial here, but it doesn't allow you the flexibility that the method I'm going to show you now gives you. And so I thought it would be worthwhile sharing this in case any of you needed to do this kind of procedure. So let's jump in. First thing I want to do now is I just want to get rid of this bottom piece here. This is called the sepals, because I don't need to animate this with the rest of the flower. And so I'm going to just split it off. So what I can do here is just select here, and I can just say select 3D connected geometry, and you can see it selects that one, and I hit enter, splits it. I'm going to invert the selection, and now I have my flower. So now I have my sepals. The other thing I want to do here is just do a clean, and I can actually probably do it up here. And I do want to just keep my UVs. Everything else that's coming in here, shot material path, name, FBX, rotation, all that stuff, I don't need any of that stuff, especially because I only have petals and the sepals, and I'm going to kind of build my own shaders for that anyway. And I have the UVs. So if you have a look here, you can see we have really nice UVs, which are quite important in the setup that we're going to do. All right, so now that we have that, what we want to do is we want to create a for each connected piece. If you've watched my knitting series, then you know that this kind of for each connected piece and this class attribute is quite important. And so what we're going to do again, as we did there, is we're going to use a sort node. And what we want to do this time is we want to sort by Y. And if we have a look at, let's take a look at this class attribute. So it looks like that. And without the sort, it looks like that. Now you just see colors, but if we look at values, so I'm going to change this now to a marker. And it's a bit crazy because there's so many of them. So without the sort, you'll see here it's like 24 and 3 and what is that, 5. So they're kind of just very randomly shaped. When we use the sort now, you can see we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's going upwards. So now my class attribute is actually traveling up the scene. So 0's at the bottom and 1's at the top. And this is going to be important when we want to do things like manipulate the flower where these top petals are treated differently to the bottom ones. So this node is quite cool. I'll make it purple just so we know that that's a cool node to be aware of. And now we're running through each petal. So we look over here. Now we have each petal and we're good to go. So the theory behind what we're going to do now is we want to create a line that is going to map itself to each of these petals. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the UVs of this petal to get that line to map there. So let's first create a line, and we'll just make sure that this is a unit of 1. which it is by default, and maybe we can give it 20 points, maybe 25. And we'll use a resample. And what I want to do with this resamples, I don't need to resample it, I just want my curveu because I've got my 25 points here. Now I just need a curveu attribute that's running from the top to the bottom. Next thing I want to do is just create a group, and I want to just group the root points, and this is going to just be the very first points of my primitive down here. So now I have the first point named root. All right, so now we have this. The next thing we want to do is we want to just transform this, and the reason for this is you can imagine that when we look at this piece here and its UVs, jump to UV view, imagine that this is 0 and this is 1 and this is 0 and this is 1, and we have our line over here. Now our line at the moment is sitting up here on this very first axis. We want it to sit in the middle of the UV space, and so we can just do that by moving it over by 0.5. And my scene is the wrong way around. Okay, so now we have it in the right space. So now what we want to do is we need to map this to this, and we can do this very simply with an attribute wrangle. I need to actually swap these around. So our line is going into the first input. Our geometry is coming into the second input, okay? And what we want to use here is we want to use something called UV sample. So we're going to say vector pos, or UV pos. We can maybe make it more explicit. UV pos equals UV sample. And we want to sample on the first input. So we want to sample on the geometry. We want to sample the current position of our line based on the UVs and at P. Okay, so that's the kind of function that you write to sample the UV position of each of these points on this. So then all we have to do is we have to just then write the position to this UV pos. Now it doesn't look like anything happened, but if we look here, now you can see that this line is mapped perfectly to the center of our geometry. Now if we didn't have this transform, you'll see that it's wrong because it's not in the center. And for this to work as it needs to work, we just need this line to be centered into a 0 to 1 space. And if we go here, we now have all of these mapping perfectly to our flowers. So it's pretty much just one wrangle. And just to kind of drive home what this is doing, if we drop down another attribute wrangle and just need an attribute promote, and this is just to kind of explain it, we're not actually going to use this. So I'm just promoting the UV attribute from a vertex to a point. And so now if I say V at P, I'm going to just say V at P equals V at UV. So I'm taking the current points of all of these and I'm saying move them into the UV space. And you can see now we're moving this flower petal into UV space, which is the same as this, right? Just now in geometry land. So this is still points. We're moving it, all these points into UV space. And if you have a look at our line, you can see that our line, let's just swap this view. Our line is in the middle of this flower. So we're kind of doing the same thing, but in reverse, where we're moving the line to the petal rather than the petal to the line. So it's just kind of the inverse of what I just showed. So now we have all these lines. Of course, what I need to do here is just merge back in my geometry. What is going on here? So now I have my geometry and lines. So let's just create some groups so that we can specify the differences. So this is going to be my flower petal geo. And this is going to be my curves. Okay. The other thing that I want to do here is I want to attribute transfer my class attribute back onto this, because the for each loop takes it away. It doesn't keep it in, but I want it in. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I am getting some transforms for these attributes. And so I'm going to use an orient along curve. And I don't need these, but I am going to create a 3x3 transform matrix. And if we have a look at this, we can see our transform matrix over here, and it just kind of creates this spine. And you can see that based on this Z or Z, the blue one and the green one, we'll have a perfectly nice kind of curve that we can roll up and down. Let's turn that off. And then we need a rig doctor. For KineFX, you need a rig doctor. And I'm not going to initialize the transforms because I've just created my own already, but I will do a name here. So now we have a name. And now when we jump to the end here, you'll see that I have names with everything. But something that's broken here is that our names now have a lot of duplicates because we're running this over each stem individually. And so now the names are overlapping. So we can just use another attribute wrangle, and let's just fix overlapping names. Okay, so what we want to do now, I'm just making sure that this isn't too messy. Okay. So we're going to say that the name, so we're writing the name back to itself. And we want to say the point underscore. So that's, you can see the name is already point underscore. So we're basically just rewriting whatever's on the other side of this. And we're writing our own name attribute. So now we've just written our own name attribute, and we could probably even get rid of this rig doctor because we're doing it all manually, but I like to have that in there because it sometimes does things that KineFX needs. So I'll just leave it there. But now we have no overlapping names, and we've given each point its own name. So the next thing now that I need to do is I just want to split off my curves from my geometry. So split geo and curves. And I created those groups so that I could easily just do that. And if we have a look at our null here, you can see we have our curves this side, and on this one we have our petals. So what we'll first do here is let's just do a group delete. You'll see that on this stream here I have a few empty groups, so I'll just delete unused groups, and so now I don't have anything that I don't need anymore. And we will then come back to the stream in a second, and we're going to run over each of these petals again, and we're going to do some weight distribution. So on this other side, what we want to do is we want to use an attribute promote, and we're going to take that class attribute that we've just created. In fact, we can visualize that again. Let me actually just delete this one and visualize class. Okay, so we have our class attribute going from 0 to whatever they are, and we want to kind of fit it from 0 to 1. And so we can use an attribute remap to take class attribute, or not class, or yeah, we first need to promote it to points from a primitive attribute. Okay, so we can now grab class, it's not letting me, and compute the range. And now we have, so there's 24. And so now we have a 0 to 1. Now it doesn't look totally right. Let's just give it a new name. We're going to call this petalmask. And then let's see petalmask. Okay, so now we have kind of a 0 to 1. And you can kind of see that this is working really well. But this value may be different in your projects. And so a cool way to set this up so that it's procedural. So as you put in new flowers and different number of petals and whatever, this always works, is we're going to take this class attribute, we're going to promote it, and then we're going to do another attribute promote. And we're going to just take the class attribute, we're going to promote it to a detail. We won't delete the original. But now if we have a look at our detail attribute, it tells us that we have 12 attribute of 12. So we should have 12 of these. I feel like we should have more. Let's do the maximum. There we go. So we want to make sure that we are outputting the maximum, not the average, which is half. So we have 24 of these curves, and now we can use that in this here. So we can use a detail expression. So we want to look up the detail of the incoming input, and we want to look up the class attribute, and now we have that. So now we're fitting 0 to 1 our petal mask attribute, which we can use later in some other things, and I'll show you how it's fun to use this later on. The next thing we need to do now is we need to transfer these onto these with a weight attribute that we can use in KineFX. And so what I'm going to do now is do another for each connected piece. But I don't need the connectivity because I already have connectivity. And so I'll do that. And we're going to use a capture proximity. A bone capture proximity, right? So if we plug this into like this, you'll see that it doesn't seem to want to work. We can do 10 here and we'll leave that at 2. So it seems to kind of be working, but you can see here that there's some issues, and that's because I have all these and only one petal. I need to make sure that I only have one of these for each of these. And so I can just use a blast node, and what I want to blast is I want to blast the corresponding one of these that matches to this. And so I can create a meta import node over here, and this will now let me easily fetch in the right kind of iteration here. So what I want to blast, I want to blast the class attribute that is equal, and I would need to use these little backticks because I'm actually fetching a string thing. I don't know. I just know that that's what you have to do. And I want to go to the for each meta. I want to look up the iteration. And remember, because we've sorted class and we're running over the class attribute in this wrangle, we know that these are matching. So to make sure to add in these backticks with a class and make sure that this is a point attribute, and we want to delete non-selected. So now we have the right curve that's matching with this. And you can see now it's no longer broken, it's perfectly aligned. And if you have a look at all of them, I can use a layer paint, capture layer paint. You can use this if you want to paint in values, but I also just use this to kind of visualize what's going on. And you can see all the weight. Sometimes you may need to just kind of change this, and this just blurs the edges. But I find a value of 2 works. And if this is not going far enough, based on the proximity of this line, you just need to increase it to make sure that it's covering your whole petal. So that's those 2 things over there. So now we have these on here and we have our curves. We need to now do something with our curves to make them move. So we can just move this over. We're going to use a rig wrangle. I love this. Rig wrangle just lets you kind of write code over these curves, and it's pretty fun. So we're going to say this is going to be the animate inwards. So this is going to be like how we close these into each other. And let's just make this like a nice blue. Okay, so then what we're going to do after this is a bone deform. And this goes into the first input. We need our static into the second, and this goes into the third. So this one is unanimated. The animated one is coming into here. All right, so let's start with the simplest kind of pre-rotate function, and then we're going to add to it and expound on it to make it bigger. If I click on this little arrow here, it just takes away those handles, and it's sometimes easier to see what's going on. I can also get rid of my petal class. Okay, so we're going to use a pre-rotate function, and this basically needs a matrix and then an amount that it's going to kind of move and the vector that it needs to move around. So we'll use the for at a local transform. Then we need a kind of a rotation, we'll call it that. And then we need the axis. Now these are attributes that I haven't created yet. So obviously it'll error out because I don't have those. So I know my rotation is a float, and I know it needs to be in radians. So we will create a float radians, and the axis is a vector. So we will then create a vector, and maybe we'll just do these little brackets, and we can say, let's try that. I pretty much have to try the right axis every time. And here, let's just create a slider. So this is going to be a channel, and we'll just call this rotation. Oh, I have to give it a name. So this is rotation, and this vector is called axis. Wrong. Okay. Now we are good to go. So basically now you can see that I am rotating these, and it is not working. And the reason it's not working is, I think, because I am on the wrong axis. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to make sure in this orient along curve, I'm using the curve normal, but I don't want to use the curve normal, and I can just drop down a rig, visualize rig, and we can then kind of visualize what these look like. I'm going to make them huge so we can see it quite easily. There's a way to change it. Okay, there we go. So this is what it's doing now, which looks cool. But if I look at it here, and now they're too big. Let's split it. Yeah, okay. So if we have a look at it here, you can see that these green ones are facing this way from left to right, but then this one is suddenly facing from right to left. I'm not sure how visible that is here. Maybe if we go down to these bottom ones, you can see, oh, those ones all seem fine. And you'll just find that some random ones are facing in the wrong direction, and like this guy here. And what that's doing is it's flipping it around so that when you rotate it, it'll go down and the others will go up. So we need to fix that. And the main culprit of this is where we're setting our orients over here. And instead of curve normal, we can just specify the up, and you can see how all those snapped. And now we have a much better direction. And sometimes here I also like to just change this to previous edge, and it just changes the tangent a little bit more accurately in this case. Okay, so now what we can do is we don't need this visualize rig anymore, but now hopefully, and now I think we have the wrong axis again because we changed axes. Let's try this one. Okay, so now we are better. So let's just edit parameter interface. I want this rotation to be, let's say, -90 and 90 because we're working in radians. So this is actual degrees. So it's 90 degrees and not, and it's maybe too big. Let's just go maybe 15 and 15. Otherwise, that's really hard to dial in. Okay, so now we have our flower and we have some rotation. And that is cool. So you could definitely use it just like this and animate this in like this and let Vellum take care of it, and it'll look totally fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but obviously we want this to look a little bit cooler, and so let's do that. So the first thing that I want to do now is I want to kind of add some variation into the way that these move, and we have this attribute here. Let's just call this petalmask. It's sometimes easy to add the name into the kind of, or add, yeah, the actual attribute name into the node name, so that when I'm working down here, I don't have to click on the node to see what I called it. I can just see here what I called it. I just find that's kind of a neat little trick. Okay. So I have this. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to remove the radians from this section, and I'm going to add it in at the very end. So I can work with all my kind of data here, and then at the very end, I'm going to write it all into radians, and that'll make sense in a second because I'm going to be working with 0 to 1 values like this here. As you can see, my petal mask is 0 to 1. Remapping everything to radians gets a bit tiresome, so here I can just kind of do it all in the end. Next thing I want to do is I want to create this mask, and this is going to be our petal mask, and so we can just say if at petal mask. And then finally, what we can do is we can say the float rot final, I don't know, is going to be our rotation times our mask. And so this here now needs to be rot final. Okay, so now we have this, and you can see now the middle ones are affected more than the outer ones. And so maybe what we want to do is we want to put this into a channel ramp. So we can do a channel ramp, and this is going to be our mask value, and it's going to be a petal mask. So now if we drop that like that, so we can now flip it. So now just the bottom ones are going in, or, you know, we can change it and have some, I don't know, whatever, some randomness like that. Now, this isn't actually what I want in this case because I want them all to go in. I want to be able to control the amount along the curve. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just keep this one here, and this is going to be animate inwards with petal mask. And let's just set this back to linear. Okay, and what I like to do in a lot of my files is just kind of keep a lot of options of these rig wrangles, and sometimes I'll steal stuff and put them into others, and it just helps to iterate quickly so that we can move along quickly. Okay, so I don't actually want to use petal mask here. I want to use curveu, which we created in the very beginning, and that's just a 0 to 1 attribute along each curve. So now when we move this, you can see they all are moving, but this is going to dictate how much of the petal itself moves. And I don't want to see this. There. Okay. So now when this is moving, you can see I can make it just the tip is now going to move, right? And I'm controlling along this petal which parts move. So I get a lot more control over this, which is really nice. So I can also, if I wanted, I could just rotate the bottom half of this. And you can see the top isn't moving, or I can do the bottom and the top, but the middle doesn't move. Like this. So now I'm getting this really nice curling, and you can also extend this, right? So as this goes nearer, and you get this crazy curl, and obviously now it's breaking, but so yeah, this is another kind of option where you can get some really nice control. Something else that's really cool to do with this is to remap this mask value. So right now it's going from 0 to 1, but sometimes what you want to do is you want to kind of go below 0. So then we can fit this. So we can say the mask is going to be fit 0, 1, because the mask is, the channel ramp is always 0 to 1. So we'll take mask, and instead of 0 to 1, we'll make it -1 and 1. And you'll see what that does. It goes kind of crazy. So let's just reset this to constant. And linear. Oh, let's actually make it B-spline. And I want this to be 0.5. So now our flower is back to where it was in the beginning. So 0.5 is now our new 0. But you can see now that we have a lot more control, where we can kind of control going downwards and upwards. So if this goes above 0.5, it goes inwards. And if it goes below 0.5, it goes downwards. And we can control this up. So we get a lot more control over how we animate this. So we can start really kind of downwards and upwards. I hope that makes sense, but it's a really cool way to animate this and to control this. And if we want the base kind of roots to be 0.5, this is how it started. And now we're kind of just curling from this point, and only it's kind of going gradually upwards. So this is what we had before, where only kind of the top half of the petal is now moving inwards. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this out a little bit, and then it's going to go up, and then this one I want to go down a little bit, maybe like that. And so it's going to start like that. And I'm going to actually start on frame 50, and I'll explain why in a second. And let's say it takes 75 frames. I'm going to go to frame 40. All right, so we just need to change this animation to go to -40. I mean, that's the same as inverting it, but okay, so now it goes in, and that's obviously too much, and this is too low or too high. So let's just play with these values a little bit. All right, so this is where I've ended up. If you have a look at it without, this is our starting flower. So it's basically where we're starting now. Everything is basically at 0. So, and as it goes up to 40, we get some intersections, but we get this kind of cool looking flower. Okay, now this isn't anything that you couldn't have done with the previous bend example, but now is when the fun part starts. So just like I said before, you can see here how there's all this kind of gap here, and I didn't really like that, so I wanted to fix that, and that's why I've given myself 50 frames to fix that, de-intersect it, and then I have from frame 50 going onwards to get this beautiful blooming effect. There's two things that I want to do. I'm just trying to figure out which one to start with. The first thing I want to do is I want to kind of crunch these inwards so that this gap between on the Y direction is smaller, so this gap here. So let's just tackle that first. So I'm going to use let's use another rig wrangle. Okay, so this is going to be move up and down. And we'll go some blue as well. And for this one, I want to use a translate function, right? So the other one we use a rotation function. Now I want to use a translate function, which is very similar to just a normal transform node, but now we're using it on kinefx. And this one, we just need a vector. So here I'm going to set it to something. And we want to move up and down. And so I'm going to set a distance attribute, which I don't have yet. And let's create that. And that's going to just be a float. So this is just the amount that I'm going to move up and down. And the amount that I'm going to move is based on a slider. And I want to multiply it by our petal mask. Right, so if you imagine we have a, I need an equally a float dist. So we have this, okay, I'll fix that in a second. We have this attribute that goes from 0 to 1, and we want to now just kind of move it based on that. So these bottom ones are 0, so they're not going to move at all, but these top ones will move downwards. And I have an error here. I'm missing a bracket. There we go. Okay, so now if I create this slider and I move it, you can see this is amazing. And the reason that it's moving everything, and I don't want to do that, that's a very nice fern if you want a fern. I want to just work on our root group that we created way back when. If you have a look up here, we created this root. It's actually a capital R, so let's fix that. And so now you can see that this is going upwards. Let's change this to minus. So now it's going downwards. And obviously I need this to be very slight. So this is without it. And I want it just to kind of crunch down just a little bit. And if there are intersections, that's okay, because this is running through Vellum soon. So it'll fix that. So let's start on 0. And after maybe 25 frames, it's going to be, what do we say? Maybe something like that. Oh, I didn't set a keyframe. And I'll just make these linear. These don't have to have any easing. This is purely to get a starting shape. All right, so that's cool. And these intersections will get solved. Okay, so that's working well. The next thing we want to do is we want to tackle how to move these inwards. This one is a little bit more involved, but it's not so hard. So we're going to start with a line. And the reason for this, I'm going to jump into my top view, is I want to create a kind of a center point that these pieces are going to move towards. So I'm just going to manually get this. Where is this handle? This I just want to kind of put somewhere in the middle here. Something like that works. And then I just need to make sure that it's long enough and move it downwards. Okay, something like that. And let's give it a whole bunch of points, maybe 200 points. And this is going to be kind of like how it moves in the direction that it moves. I'll show you what I mean in a second. So we're going to create an attribute wrangle. It doesn't have to be a rig wrangle, because here we're just going to create an attribute on each of these curves. Okay, so we want to call this get direction. And again, we're going to just work on our root group. We don't need anything else. And so what we want to do here is we want to look up the closest points on this line of each of these roots, and then we're going to subtract the distance, and that creates a direction, right? So we want to look at the nearest point. So we'll just create a near PT. That's going to be our kind of variable. We want to look at the near point function, near point. We want to look up on 1 and at P. So this is looking at 1, and it's looking at each of these points in this root group. It's finding the closest point on this line, and it's storing it in near PT. Then we need to do a vector position. And this is just saying, okay, on each of those positions that it's just found, let's find its position, right? So like it's writing its position. And now if we write via dir equals ppos minus at P. Okay, so if we have a look now at our dir attribute, and we just need to change it to be a marker and a vector. You can see now that these are all pointing towards this line. So if I move this line around, you can see that these are all pointing towards wherever this line goes. So if I get it somewhere near the center, these points are now going towards the center. So the next thing I can do is I can just do another rig wrangle moving these inwards. So I can just take this one, I'll copy it, And this is going to be called move inwards. Okay, and very similar to what we did here, except that I'm not going to multiply it by this. I want to multiply this here. This is a vector. I want to take this and I want to multiply it by an amount. So I can still use this dist, but then what I want to create is I want to create a vector. Let's just say move. And this move function is going to be this direction that we just created, the dir, and we want to multiply it by this dist attribute. And then this whole thing can just be set to move. Okay, nothing happens because we're in frame 0, but as, let's turn off this one and this one. And now you can see that we have movement inwards. Let's turn this off and here. Let's go to frame 25. Okay, so this is moving them. Why is this not moving? Okay, I was just visualizing something wrong there. Okay, so now you can see that we're moving these all the way to the center. And let's just visualize this and see, this may be too much movement. Maybe we kind of just go a little bit inwards, not too much, but that's enough that you don't see kind of too much of a hole there. Maybe we can go a little bit higher. And then when we add this and we move them down, so now our starting shape is starting to look a lot nicer, and we have all this control kind of built in here really easily and really funnily. It's not a word, but it sounds cool. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you how you can do, which I didn't end up doing, but is a super neat thing to do, is to use scale. So we'll use one last wrangle, and this is scale petals. Okay, so we're going to use a pre-scale function, and this again uses the full at local transform, and then it uses a vector. And in this case, I'm going to just set it to the same. So it's kind of like a uniform scaling. You can obviously do it so that it's not uniform. And now we just need a value that we're going to scale this. And in this case, I can just scale it, and I can scale it by that petal mask. So, I mean, I can just use a slider if I wanted to scale everything. But if I wanted to scale these based on kind of, you can see here, these are 0 and these are 1. If I flip this, you can see these outer petals, this one is 1 and this one is 0. And if I move these all the way up, now this is what I started. And now I can kind of change the shape of these petals. But these values are pretty sensitive. But yeah, you can, now if you wanted to kind of scale these ones here, and let's just set this to B-spline, B-spline. And you can scale these inner ones. And it's a very cool way that if you had a flower asset that you really like, but you wanted to scale them, you now have the control to do that. And obviously you can animate the scale so that you could kind of, now I'm getting this intersection, I can fix that in Vellum and move them apart and stuff. That's what I spoke about in my previous flower tutorial. But now you get all these extra controls. So again, I'm not using this one, but I'll plug it into here, and if I needed to, I have scale here. I also have the petal mask animation, and I get all this kind of just waiting in this file. So next time I need to do something like this, everything's here ready for me. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I want to run Vellum, but I know that before that I just need to pin some points. So I'm going to create a tube, and this flower is not actually fully centered. So what I'll do is just jump into my top view and just move this a little bit more over like that. Okay, so that looks cool. This is probably a bit extreme height-wise. Okay, and then we can create a group. Come on. Group there, and this is going to be a pin. we'll create the point group, and this is going to be based on the object. So now these points in the center are grouped. And so when we run Vellum, these points won't move anywhere and everything else will move around it. It just kind of gives the simulation a little bit more of a solid look, because if you look at a flower, usually the petals on the outside are moving and the inside is stuck together. They don't all flop around uniformly. The other thing I want to do is just bring back in my sepals, and they are all the way up here. Instead of bringing this, I'm just going to create a null, say out sepals, and like that. Okay, copy this and then scroll back down, Control Shift V if you have OD tools. If not, just create an object merge and put that in there. Okay, so now I have the sepals, and you'll see now these are intersecting, and so we kind of need to treat these as well. And I'm going to show you another kind of kineffect setup to animate these sepals in a second, but let's just do the Vellum part and then we'll do the sepals. So we're going to do a Vellum cloth. We need a Vellum constraint, and this Vellum constraint is going to be a pin constraint. So Vellum pin to target, and we'll just set this to points, match animation, soft, a value of 1. And the cloth, we won't change anything. We just want to pin, let me plug something into it first. We just want to pin this pin group, and everything else can stay at default. Let's go to frame 0 before we, then we do a Vellum solver. All right, so here we just want to turn off gravity, and I'm going to just give it maybe 3 sub-steps, or 2, 3, 2, 4, whatever. I think with this it doesn't really matter too much. You'll see slightly different behavior, but it's not so bad. All right, so then the other thing I did was I just gave it a little bit of pop wind. All right, so pop wind and maybe just a small value with a small swirl size. Okay, so that just kind of gives it a little bit of switching behavior. And if we do a file cache, all right, so I did a quick file cache so we could see how this looks. And as you can see, it goes inwards and then it sucks together. And there's some problems here where there's like some crazy intersections. So let's fix that. And then the other thing you'll notice here is that our sepals are not moving. So they kind of just chill there and they don't do anything. And obviously we want to fix that. So let's address all these little problems. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to go into our cloth settings, and we just want to increase the bend stiffness just so that it's not so bendy, and so these polygons can't kind of like wrap around themselves and distort. And the other thing I like to do with these types of setups is just to change this to set uniform, and it just changes the mass, so it's 0.1. And if you look at the calculate varying, it's really small values, whereas when you set it like this, it kind of just makes it a little bit more of a uniform behavior. So changing nothing else, if I now simulate this in the background, we'll come back and have a look at this, but let's take a look at these sepals while that runs. So what we want now is we kind of just want to do the same thing we've done before, where we take this a skeleton and we just kind of roll these in so that we can animate these as we would want. And so I'll double check that these are not 2 faces, are they? 359, no, okay, so these are single faces. Sometimes you get polygons like this and you have doubles, and then you just need to fix that, but for now that's fine. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to use a skeleton node, and this one I'm actually going to just do manually because sometimes it's much faster than trying to build something procedurally. And so I'm doing 5 points in each, and I hit enter, and I can just kind of come back here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I don't need these to be super precise. It's kind of just the background detail, but all right, so let's go here and see if this happens. You can see that there's this modify mode, and then you can just modify these points. if it lets me. Tweak mode, that's what I need. So now I can tweak it. Okay, and there's one more over here. Let's move that up. All right, so now we have that. And one of the reasons that you can't do the other method that we had here is that this is all one mesh, right? This is not split up into separate meshes. Now we could split this into separate meshes if we wanted to, but for now we'll just kind of just do this manual approach because it's also a cool way to know and to use sometimes. So we have our skeleton. Then the next thing we're going to do is use a bone capture lines, and we need a tet embed, and we need a bone capture by harmonic. Now these three nodes in this capture method, so with our petals we used this capture proximity. We're going to look at a different one now where we use this one, and these are the three nodes that you need to make this work. That goes in there and there, and then that goes in there and there. Okay, so skeleton goes into the bone capture lines, the mesh goes into the first, bone into the second, and bone capture by harmonic. And so you get this if we had a bone deform. And as before, we can now plug our skeleton into here. This is our rest geometry, and then we can use a rig pose. And I like to just do this just to make sure that this is all working. So if we grab one of these, it is working. So, I mean, you can even manually do this if you want, but we will use a little rig wrangle, just a super quick one like we did up here without all the fancy stuff. So we can actually copy this over, and let's just remove some of the fancy. Okay, we will use a, let's say, resample. So we have curveu. That just gives us a little bit more control. We don't need that, but we will use that. And we won't remap it. And everything else is good. So what we can do is just set this to linear. And let's just see what this looks like. Okay, so that finally did it. So I just needed a polypath node to initialize these into one kind of curve that I could resample. And now they are working. It's on the wrong axis. So as always, let's figure out the right one. I think that is the right one. Yeah, okay, so it's going the wrong direction, and we can just do that. Okay, so now we're getting something cool, and we obviously don't want it to just be there. We can do something like this. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll visualize our flower as well. Okay, and we want to just match the animation. So it's going to come in, and then it's going to go like that. And obviously we don't want it to look like this. We want to actually make these ones less and this one more. Let's make these go down. So I'm actually going minus. So this is where that remap trick would have helped us. So we don't actually go minus, but for now this is actually fine. Okay, so you can kind of see how it's moving in, and I want it to move in far enough that it's going to actually intersect. But you can see here that this side is intersecting, and let's just merge these two geometries so we can see it a little bit more clearly. I'm just throwing a color on here so we can visualize this side more, whatever. Okay, so you can see that this is intersecting quite a lot. So I can just use a simple transform node here to get this a little bit more in place. All right, that looks pretty good because it's not intersecting at the start, so Vellum should take care of the rest of that for us. It's still a little bit skew. All right, I think that's okay. And so what we can do now is just pipe this into here. I don't need this color. And then we can just move this whole thing up. And we can add a group just so that afterwards we can easily split this if we need to, or when we need to for rendering. right, so let's just check how that ended up looking. Okay, obviously we haven't added in that, but you can see now that these are not jittering, and you get this really nice behavior, and the wind is affecting it really nicely, and it looks cool. So let's just do one final one with the sepals, and I'll see you in a second. All right, so now we have our flower that's simulated, and you can see these sepals are coming up. Something that you can notice is that it's not all the way up, so I would animate this transform just to push it all the way in. You can play also with the way that it folds and all that kind of stuff. You have all the controls. And the last thing we need to do now is just do a retime. I'm not actually going to retime it. We're just going to fit range, and we want to take in the first 150 frames, but we don't want to use the first 25 because that was kind of like our settling phase, right? So we can then take, and we just want to reverse it. I think this is right. So now we get this. So now we have this cool blooming effect. I wanted to start on frame 21, on 1. All right, so now it's slowed down a little bit. So let me get this right. Yeah, it's a bit slow, but now we have this cool blooming effect. And then we have a little bit of buffer here where it kind of just moves around once it's opened. And you can, of course, retime this, which is what I did, so that it kind of opens up and then it slowly chills out. And that just depends on what kind of situation you want to do with it. But I hope that this has kind of given you some cool tips and tricks of how you can make these types of setups where you bring in your flowers over here and you add your stems and all that, animate it, run it through Vellum, bring in your extra geometry here, feed it all in, and you get something that I think looks pretty cool. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you next month where we will tackle a new project.